Hi, guys. Good evening. Just about 7 p.m. Welcome to May of 2024. Um, it's still about 80 degrees here in Baltimore City. I'm hoping for a bigger crowd, but the Yankees and Orioles are playing down the street from my house right now at Camden Yards. So um, I hope to go to tomorrow's day game if it's not too hot. Um, Before we get started, I want to thank Noah. I think you're joining us from New England, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, I live in Connecticut.
Okay, welcome. I wanted to thank Patrick for snaring Noah. Make sure we got him on board. As you guys know, we are probably one of the most sought after chapters, and we have people we're booking into September and October now. So hopefully this will be a very interesting topic. I've been looking forward to it all week. One quick announcement slash snafu is June 30th. I made a boo-boo because I had something on my calendar incorrectly. If you guys remember seeing the invite, go down to see the Big Train Baseball. It's an event with the Bob Davids chapter down in Bethesda. See a baseball game. I think it was late morning, maybe around noon. At Ripken Collegiate League Baseball there at the Big Train in Bethesda. Since I had it on my calendar as the wrong day, I also scheduled our joint minor league outing the same day. In Reading. It's us and Baltimore chapter and the Philadelphia chapter. It's actually Bowie at Reading, but that's an evening game. So technically, if you really want to push it, you can go to both events. But the information on the Reading game will be coming out in the next couple of days. Probably about $40 or so a ticket. Big Train game is 10 a.m. Thanks, Patrick. I knew it was in the morning. That's a DC chapter event. We're just helping co-sponsor it. Because obviously we have a lot of members who live in the DC metro area in Columbia. So anyway, that being said,
okay, how are you doing?
And I'll let you take it from here. I gave you screen sharing, so looking forward to this. And guys, hold your questions till the end. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up and running the way it should be. And here we go. Yeah, so happy to be here tonight. This is really exciting. My name is Noah Gittell. I guess you'd say I'm a film critic primarily, but I've done a little baseball writing over the years. A couple years ago, I wrote this piece for the New York Times, come for the broadcast day for the Mets game, about some of the cinematic techniques that John DeMarsico, the Mets SNY telecast director, was incorporating into the broadcast. And then I wrote this other piece for Defector about how Seinfeld transformed from a Mets show to a Yankees show over the course of its run, and a few other pieces along the way. But I'm here primarily to talk about Baseball, the movie, which is not a movie. It is a book. Don't make the mistake many others have made already that have led me to think it's not the best title. This is a book I've written. It's available for pre-order now. It comes out on May 14th. And this is essentially a biography of the baseball movie genre. It traces its evolution over the years with a special eye towards how the baseball movie reflects and in some cases affects cultural change. So it's a baseball book, it's a movie book, it's a history book, it's a political book in some ways too, I think. And the reason I chose this topic was I love baseball, I love movies, I love baseball movies, but I also think the baseball movie is an ideal genre through which to view America, because it is the collision of these two national pastimes, baseball and cinema. And I hope you like the book. It is a research book. It is also a research-driven book. It's also an opinion book in a lot of ways. So some of my opinions about these films might make you angry, but hear me out, and we can get into it in the Q&A afterwards if you want to. So what I'm going to do now is sort of give you an overview of the narrative that is in this book. Obviously, I go into much more detail in the book itself, and if you're interested in purchasing it, I would be thrilled. But let's start at the beginning because movies and baseball have a lot in common. They have really walked together throughout history in lockstep. They were both invented in the 1800s. They surged in popularity in the 1900s and 1910s as immigrants and rural Americans sort of flocked to the cities. I think the movies were an escape from the stresses of the city, from urban crime, from exhaustion, from heat waves, as you can see here. And they took viewers to places that they couldn't imagine, fantastical places. Baseball, I think, metaphorically, with its wide open spaces and its sort of childlike charm, returned people to places they had left behind. In the 1920s, both movies and baseball were threatened by, I guess we could say, culture wars, or at least notions of corruption. Baseball, of course, had their famous gambling scandal with the 1919 White Sox, and that scandal frightened owners so much that they created the office of the commissioner to clean up baseball, or at least make it look like baseball was cleaned up. At the same time, the movies were threatened by the Catholic League and the Legion of Decency, who was very concerned about the adult content that was increasingly finding its way into popular movies. They were threatening boycotts. They had censorship bills working their way through the state legislature. And the movies, Hollywood created the Hays Code, or the production code, which was a set of rules that films had to follow in terms of their content in order to be distributed. So some similarities there for sure. Both film and baseball had to adapt to television. They both dealt with free agency, with actress Olivia de Havilland winning the same rights for actors that Curt Flood would win for ball players many years later. And I think here in the 21st century, each of them has fallen a bit from their perch atop American culture. Film is now clearly second to streaming series, television, while baseball has had to create new rules to match the excitement and popularity of the NBA and the NFL. But what of the baseball movie itself? The baseball movie, this collision of both of these forces. The baseball movie has existed in various forms almost as long as cinema itself. Many ball players, including Babe Ruth, you must know, were stars of some of the first newsreels. I mean, these were the things people watched in movie theaters. Babe Ruth himself also starred in as a thinly veiled version of himself in 1920's Heading Home, a feature-length film. There were other baseball movies in these early days, like an adaptation of Casey at the Bat, starring Wallace Beery. He was one of the biggest stars at the time. There was a film called Girls Can Play, starring a young Rita Hayworth, which was about a gangster that starts a women's baseball league to draw attention away from his bootlegging business. And there was, of course, Joe E. Brown, perhaps Hollywood's biggest baseball fan at the time, who made 3 baseball movies, the best of which was clearly Alibi Ike. Now, none of these movies made very much money, and there was a consensus that started to form in Hollywood that baseball movies were box office poison. Those were the words used by Samuel Goldwyn, who, when they brought the idea of making a movie about Lou Gehrig to him, he wasn't interested. Then he watched the newsreel footage of Lou Gehrig's actual speech, and he changed his mind completely. He wasn't wrong that baseball movies were box office poison, but he did want to make this movie, and the way that he found to do it that would make it more than a baseball movie was to focus really on the love story between Lou and Eleanor Gehrig, and also on the sickness of Gehrig, of course, and the dignified death that he experiences in the final reel. And I start my book with Pride of the Yankees because, to me, this is when the baseball film really found its true purpose as an expression of American values. The film came out in 1942. It was conceived and made in 1941 and early 42, with America on the verge of World War II. And I think Pride of the Yankees really served as a metaphor for that war and the experiences that many Americans were about to have. It was an inspiration for young men who were about to go overseas and face potential death, and for their wives and parents who had to sit in the crowd and watch them put themselves in harm's way and potentially be cut down in the prime of their lives. Pride of the Yankees is about dying with dignity in many ways. So the filmmakers weren't shy about drawing connections to the war. Of course, the opening voiceover of the film, which was written by Damon Runyon, wrote that Garrick faced death with the same valor and fortitude that had been displayed by thousands of young Americans on the far-flung fields of battle. He left behind a memory of courage and devotion that will ever be an inspiration to all men. So they're making it just about as clear as can be. And in many ways, the Pride of the Yankees, because it was so successful, commercially, critically, and at the Academy Awards, where it was nominated for Best Picture, became a template on which many future baseball movies would be based. The discovery of a hot young talent out of nowhere, his rise to stardom, health challenges were common in these movies. Many future films would employ this template, especially in the years following the war, directly following the war, when baseball became a metaphor not just for combat, but for the problems that afflicted veterans in the 40s and 50s. We had The Winning Team, of course, with Ronald Reagan playing Grover Cleveland Alexander, which addresses, among other things, alcoholism. Angels in the Outfield, the original Angels in the Outfield, in a way addresses kind of the malaise and loneliness of the middle-aged man at this time. I think the Stratton story actually does it best. This is a film about Monty Stratton, a major leaguer who lost his leg in a hunting accident and returned to professional baseball. But its resonance is in this war metaphor to me. When we watch Monty Stratton, played by Jimmy Stewart, deal with his disability, we watch him stomp around the house, so angry and disillusioned. We watch him snap at his wife and children. I think that he really serves as a symbol of men who return from war with physical or mental disabilities. And the casting of Stewart in this role, who fought in World War II and came home with noticeable trauma. I mean, his hair had turned gray. I think that really adds to the metaphor, and it really works that way. Another affliction, albeit a slightly more lighthearted one, that was the subject of several post-war baseball films, is what they called baseball fever. It's not quite as debilitating as amputation. In fact, I bet most of us here tonight suffer from it. But there were numerous films at this time that hinted at the idea, or outright said it, that obsession with baseball was a dangerous thing. There was the comedy It Happens Every Spring, about a science professor played by Ray Milland, who they say in the film would have made tenure years ago if it weren't for the fact that his mind is elsewhere for 6 months out of every year. It ends up working out for him when he invents a substance that repels wood, and he uses it to become a major league pitcher. There's a similar issue at play for Joe Boyd, the middle-aged protagonist of Damn Yankees, whose wife complains about his obsession in the film's opening number, which is very funny, called 6 months out of every year. And the lyrics to that go, "When we met in 1938, it was November. When I said that I would be his mate, it was December. I reasoned he would be the greatest husband a girl ever found. That's what I reasoned. That's what I reasoned." And then April rolled around. Again, this is all very lighthearted, but it does speak to a change already in how baseball was portrayed from the upstanding, wholesome character of the game in The Pride of the Yankees and the Stratton story and Angels in the Outfield, where the game is a chance for redemption, redeems mankind in those movies. In these movies, it's almost like baseball is something we have to wrestle with, we have to avoid. And I think that speaks to a change in the American identity in the 1950s, when the civil rights era was burgeoning and there were terrifying fears of nuclear war, and McCarthyism was shaking the foundation of the nation. That sense of unease and anxiety in the American character, the baseball movie was starting to reflect that. Baseball is really the perfect space for these anxieties to play out, and it's even more evident, I think, in Fear Strikes Out, 1957, I believe, the semi-true story of Jimmy Pearsall, a Red Sox outfielder who suffered an extended nervous breakdown on the field, essentially, and was treated with electroshock therapy and lithium before it was used in more popularly, before eventually returning to the game. And in some ways, it's interesting. This film has a similar arc to the Stratton story, or The Winning Team, about a young phenom who comes up and then suffers challenges, in this case, a mental health challenge as opposed to a physical challenge. But I think the film digs really deep into the American soul to identify what ails it. In this case, it's Pearsall's dysfunctional relationship with his father that takes center stage. His father has baseball fever himself, and he pushes Jim too hard to make it to the major leagues. This is the results. The relationship between a father and son is so fundamental to this game and its place in the American iconographic landscape. So it's very subversive, very thoughtful of Fear Strikes Out to look at that relationship and see something so twisted and rotten. And again, we would never have seen this even 10 years earlier when we were just a few years out of World War II. I must point out here, though, when we talk about Fear Strikes Out, the baseball in the movie is just god awful. I mean, I think Ron Shelton called it the low point in American sports movies. Tony Perkins appears to have never picked up a bat or a glove in his life before the film began shooting. And it makes no sense on the one hand, because he's supposed to be this incredible defender. On the other hand, it kind of works tonally for the movie because everything about this movie is a little skewed and a little off kilter. So after Fear Strikes Out, there weren't any baseball movies for a while. And no, I'm not going to count Safe at Home. But when we get to the 1970s, we really see the baseball movie changing and starting to reflect the spirit of that era. The disillusionment of Watergate, the unrest of the Vietnam protests, the loss in Vietnam, it changed the spirit of the country. And it was a sadder place and a less victorious place. And that changes the baseball movie for a while. I think Bang the Drum Slowly is a really excellent example of this. That's the poster on the left originally, and then once Robert De Niro became a star and they put out the DVD, of course, he went right on the front of the DVD there. But it's a great example because in some ways the film is a counterpoint to Pride of the Yankees. Both are stories about players on a New York baseball team who get stricken with a deadly disease. The difference is that in Pride of the Yankees, it's a rousing story. It's a story about dignified death. Whereas in Bang the Drum Slowly, it's just a kind of sad, long fade out, and the redemptions are minimal, I would say. This is Bruce Pearson as the lead character, played by De Niro, and his teammate, star pitcher Henry Wiggin, decides to help Pearson, knowing that he is sick, by negotiating a contract in which their fates on the roster are tied. That's basically the concept of the movie. So Pearson can't get sent down unless the pitcher gets sent down, and that's never going to happen. It's a nice thing that he does for him. He wants Pearson to experience a little fun, have a nice hot streak before he goes. But it's not Brian's song. These characters don't become best friends. They don't fall in love with each other. It basically, like, the pitcher learns to be a little bit nicer, and then Pearson, presumably just after the closing credits, dies. Not a lot of redemption there. Of course, baseball was also going through its own disillusionment at this time that mirrored the disillusionment in the country. We had Jim Bouton's Ball 4 come out in 1970. This one is, of course, an account of one journeyman pitcher's year in the majors. It told about cursing and gambling and womanizing among ball players. All the secrets that journalists had hid for the greater good of the game were revealed. You could also argue that the advent of free agency in this era was a disillusionment as well, as it revealed the cold, hard economics behind the game, robbing us of some of our youthful naivete. Bang the Drum Slowly reflects all of this, by the way. In fact, there's even a connection to Bouton, if you squint. It's barely mentioned in the film, but this pitcher, the character Wiggin, is supposed to be an author who has written a tell-all book about baseball before the movie starts. So over the course of the film, we see players acting like jerks, bullying younger players, bilking tourists out of cash. It shows players as they really are, not as we wish them to be. And in a sense, Bang the Drum Slowly is sort of an adaptation of Ball 4. It shares all of its disillusionments. Then we got The Bad News Bears, which came out in 1976, just a few years later, which I think also springs from the same cultural conditions. Its hero is a drunk, washed-up ex-ball player who got bitter and quit when he didn't make the majors. He drinks hard liquor for breakfast. He uses his kid ball players as free labor. Of course, The Bad News Bears, like this idea resonated so much that it became the template for like every underdog sports movie that followed, not just in baseball, but also, you know, like The Mighty Ducks and like a whole lot of other movies. It's the first movie about a ragtag group of outsiders who come together to try to topple the establishment team. That's a very familiar story now in 2024. It has a lot in common, I think, with Rocky, actually, which came out the same year, because they're both very subversive in that neither one of them ends with a real victory, or they each end with a moral victory, I guess, which was apropos for a nation that had just exited Vietnam 1 year earlier and was kind of grappling with what victory means. Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars and Motor Kings is also an important film for this time in that it tells a story of race in baseball that I think would not have been possible even a few years earlier. If you haven't seen it, it's the first film of its time about the Negro Leagues at all. And that's an important bit of progress to not hide that part of baseball's history. Again, it is about a ragtag group of outsiders. This is a barnstorming team created by two players who were fed up with their poor working conditions in the Negro Leagues. It's kind of a slight film. I don't think it's very hard-hitting. It's a comedy, but it does show what life in the Negro Leagues was like, both the hardships and the fact that these players were celebrities in their Black communities, and also how they were mistreated by ownership, which is an important part of the story. And even more importantly, I think it shows towards the end the kind of bittersweet element of integration, how Black players coming to the major leagues destroyed the Negro Leagues, how it robbed them of their cultural power and their economic power, and how that's a very bittersweet, complicated thing. This film could not have happened in the 40s or 50s when baseball films were essentially American propaganda, and movies like the Jackie Robinson story existed basically just as an advertisement for integration. So that's the 70s, and now we enter the baseball movie boom. This covers all manner of baseball films. We've got nostalgic baseball films like The Natural and Field of Dreams. Those posters, like, they even look a little similar, don't they? These films, to me, fetishize the Cooperstown myth that baseball is a rural sport. So important to baseball. Not entirely true, of course. These films seem to suggest that baseball sprung out of the land, out of the Midwestern dirt itself. And they tinker, I think, with this unabashed myth-making in fundamental ways. The Natural through its like gambling subplot, and Field of Dreams with its ambivalence towards the counterculture and 60s activism. But I think they still ultimately are founded on this idea that baseball is just a simple, good thing, and it always has been. They actually fit into me very well with Ronald Reagan's vision of America at this time, which is a return to the post-war era, essentially trying to claim that the 60s never happened, or at least that they shouldn't have happened. And then you've got films like 8 Men Out and Major League, which I think are both in different ways a little more honest about baseball. They would fit in more in the 70s in a weird way. In fact, John Sayles wrote 8 Men Out in the 70s. Sayles, by the way, wrote the foreword to my book. If you want some more writing of his on baseball, that'd be a good place to find it. But he was inspired to make 8 Men Out after watching All the President's Men, because he saw it as another conspiracy movie. While Major League, I think, owes a lot of its rambunctious spirit to Slapshot. I think that's a great template for it. So in a way, these are 70s movies that, became a little more commercial in the 80s. But they're also both films about economics, about working class issues, and in a way they could be seen as kind of responding to a lot of what was going on in the country at the time. But I don't know, in the case of Major League, that's probably giving it a little too much credit. The other trend of baseball cinema in the 80s is that accuracy became very crucial. Probably because these films were made by a generation that grew up on television. They expected their movies to look realistic, and we expected them to look realistic. Robert Redford had a sweet swing. D.B. Sweeney in 8 Men Out, he was intent on looking like Shoeless Joe Jackson. He learned to hit a lefty, and he wanted to hit what he called a legitimate triple in one of the shots. And then you got Charlie Sheen, who was so committed to authenticity that he took steroids for the movie to get his fastball into the 80s. He claimed it had been there when he was in high school, and he just wanted to get back to where he was. That's a familiar story. I'm not sure anyone has come closer to looking and acting like a real ball player than Kevin Costner in Bull Durham. This is a movie that, you don't even need to know anything about baseball to know that this movie is authentic about the life of a minor leaguer. You can just feel it when you watch it. And, in that way, it sort of belongs more to the 70s than the 80s as well. Ron Shelton, its writer-director, of course, was a career minor leaguer, based the film on his own experiences. The scene in which Crash Davis floods a stadium so he and his teammates can get an off day. Shelton did that himself when he was in Amarillo. But he said it backfired because an off day in Amarillo is worse than having to play baseball. I don't have to tell you that Bull Durham is a great film, despite the horrendous pitching by Tim Robbins in it. But I think Costner, he makes up for it by looking and sounding so much like a professional baseball player. He really set the standard in this movie. And Shelton knows how to make a baseball movie. His philosophy in making this movie was to get us into places that the TV cameras can't go. So that's in the locker room. That's in between an umpire and a player who are having a shoving match when the player says the one word he can't say, and into the minds of the players with Crash Davis's internal monologue and Nuke LaLoosh's external monologue. I always thought that was a funny bit, that he was too dumb to have an internal monologue. But this is a guy, Shelton, who understands the game and understands what viewers want from it, which is a really rare combination in baseball cinema. So opinion time here. I think Bull Durham is the second best baseball movie ever made. And I think A League of Their Own is the number one baseball movie ever made. And it's not necessarily because of its baseball. Like, I think the baseball in A League of Their Own is very competent. I think we graded on a curve a little bit, not because they're women, but because they're not professionals to begin with, because they're amateurs. They're very easy to relate to, though, because of that. You know, they're like me. They never thought they'd get a chance to play professional baseball, and here they are getting their one summer doing it. I just think it's a great movie. It's a movie that knows that baseball is synonymous with summer. You can feel that when you're watching it. It's funny. It's tragic. It's a character-driven story. You know, the interpersonal drama between Kit and Dottie is so well drawn. I think it drives the whole movie, and it culminates in this incredible climax of this unanswered question that has carried the movie. It kept it in the cultural imagination for 30 years. People are still talking about this movie 30 years later, and that's good for baseball movies, and it's actually good for baseball as well, I think. A League of Their Own, to me, represents the peak of the baseball movie genre, even if it's not your favorite, peak in popularity. And by the time the baseball movie came for the children, which would happen next, you could kind of start to feel them running out of ideas. I know people love The Sandlot. I'm going to make some enemies here. I actually don't love The Sandlot. And I'll tell you why. Because baseball is a game of nostalgia. I think we can all agree on that. Even in its early days, it looked backwards to a more agrarian time in this country. But for me, a baseball movie works best when it examines that nostalgia instead of just replicating it on screen. And that's what The Sandlot does. Movies like Eight Men Out and A League of Their Own give us that nostalgia, but they also are critical about the nostalgia, and they look at those eras through modern eyes, and that makes them more valuable to me. The Sandlot refuses to do that. It looks back at childhood through an adult narrator, like in A Christmas Story or The Wonder Years. And it just simply smiles at a time when it was safe to run around the neighborhood all day without an adult present. And it was cool to fake your own death to try to get a teenage girl to give you mouth to mouth. But I got to say, what bothers me the most about The Sandlot is the James Earl Jones-ness of it all. He plays the supposedly mean next door neighbor, who is revealed to be a very sweet former Negro Leagues player. And in this scene, he's telling the story of his exploits in the Negro Leagues he doesn't even say the Negro Leagues. He says in baseball, telling his exploits to these two kids. And he says to them that he used to play with Babe Ruth, and he even shows them a picture of him with Babe Ruth, but he couldn't make it to the majors because he went blind. Very weird that they say he went blind instead of saying, I couldn't make it to the majors because I was black and baseball hadn't integrated yet. But that is in keeping with, I think, this unexamined nostalgia of the movie, a movie that doesn't want to make any waves. And it's a shame because I think the movie has some really positive representation for Latinos in baseball with Benny the Jet. It would be a great kind of connective point between those two characters, but the film is not brave enough to do that, let's say. The kids' baseball movie boom would continue after The Sandlot with Rookie of the Year and Little Big League. One of them was a hit, one of them was not, and the public got it completely wrong, in my opinion. Rookie of the Year is a profoundly silly movie, a loose remake of 1954's Roogie's Bump. It's about a kid who stinks at baseball until he breaks his arm, the tendons heal too tight, and all of a sudden he can throw 95. That's not what I object to in Rookie of the Year. Even in a fantastical movie, this movie gets so much wrong about baseball. And I'll give you one example that just completely destroys me. The premise of the movie This kid saves the Chicago Cubs essentially because they're so bad that they're not drawing any fans and the owners are going to have to sell the team. Anybody who knows anything knows that Cubs fans are the one fandom who that could never happen to because they show up to games, whether the team is good or bad. So I know Cubs fans have like embraced this movie. And to be quite honest, I don't exactly know why, because I would be offended if I were them and this movie portrayed me in that way. It's like the screenwriters literally picked the worst team for this movie, for the concept to play out. The other thing these two movies have in common, Rookie of the Year and Little Big League, is that their preteen protagonists are both without a father, which I thought was interesting. They're both raised by single mothers. And this seems important because it sort of implies that if you don't have a father, you're going to stink at baseball. And also, I think these films speak to a generation of children that were raised in divorces, raised by single mothers. Divorces spiked in the 70s and 80s. I think that's interesting. It's kind of the only thing these two movies have in common, though, if you ask me, because I think Little Big League is a remarkably insightful film about baseball, much more insightful than Rookie of the Year. If you haven't seen it, Billy Haywood is the lead character. This kid, he inherits the Minnesota Twins from his grandfather and installs himself as manager. It's replacing the old school disciplinarian manager his grandfather had hired. So Haywood is essentially the first player's manager. He makes friends with everyone on the roster. He's not mean. He doesn't yell at them. He uses positive reinforcement to bring out their best. And he's an early sabermetrician. He questions conventional wisdom at every turn. He proves it, in fact, in this incredible early scene where he's trying to sell himself as the manager to the GM and the bench coach. They tell him he's not smart enough to know how to manage. So they give him a situation and kind of ask, what would you do? And he doesn't get overwhelmed. He just asks question after question after question after question until he arrives at his solution, which is not to bunt. And the bench coach says he's wrong. He should bunt. And the kid very clearly and quietly explains why not bunting is the correct choice. So this movie was way ahead of its time in that regard. And in fact, in the book, I have a quote from Ronnie Jazayerli, one of the early baseball prospectus guys. And he talks about how seeing this movie in a theater when he was like 19, which is like a little old for the movie, you'd think, but not really, because it's so sophisticated. He said it was a revelatory experience. It was like he felt seen, because here was somebody talking and validating all the concepts that he and his friends were talking about, and they thought they were the only ones. The other thing the movie does well is it gets its baseball action right. They cast a lot of former players, both and current players in cameos, but also former players in actual like speaking roles. And I think it's such a smart decision because it grounds this otherwise outlandish concept in something real and authentic. So I think it's a great movie. So after Little Big League, the baseball movie went into sort of a fallow period. Maybe cinema could not measure up to the impossibly large superheroes of MLB in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think there were a few standouts. My personal favorites are Fever Pitch and 61. I think those are both really good movies. Fever Pitch, you know, as a lifelong Mets fan, I think that movie has a lot of insightful things to say to me about the mentality of like following a franchise that feels cursed. I learned some things from that movie, to be perfectly honest. And 61 is like just a really sharp portrayal of the Maris Mantle home run race, directed by Billy Crystal. It did not get a theatrical release, which I think is notable, that the baseball movie was sort of waning at this time. And we did not get another important baseball movie until Moneyball, which I probably don't have to say too much about. I'll only say that, you know, it's not really about baseball. It's about the data revolution that occurred in every field around this time. And perhaps that's why so many baseball players despise it. We probably heard the players who were actually portrayed in the movie, what they thought about it. We know what Art Howe thinks about the movie, and we know what people who like Art Howe think about the movie, which is that they feel it's ridiculous. He was portrayed as a villain and as in opposition to what Billy Beane was trying to do, when in actuality, apparently he's one of the nicest guys in baseball and was pretty supportive of the Moneyball idea. Of course, this movie also ignores these guys, known as the Big Three, Hudson, Mulder, and Zito, who two of them are not even mentioned at all. I believe you see a character playing Tim Hudson blow the 11-9 lead in that one game. I think that's the only time you see him. We don't see Eric Chavez. We barely see Miguel Tejada. Players really hate this movie because, well, it upends other baseball films, which is important. You know, front office guys like Billy Beane were basically non-existent in early baseball cinema. Scouts were portrayed lovingly, these avuncular figures, and the players were heroes. Well, here, the GM is the hero, the scout is the villain, and the players are just sort of there, interchangeable, except for Hatterberg. The film's underlying arc, I think, is actually very conventional. It's another film about a ragtag group of outsiders who come together and learn to play as a team. But the details layered on top of it were truly subversive. And people who don't like baseball or know much about baseball seem to love this movie because they may not realize how subversive it is. But people who play the game seem to have a not very fond opinion of it. I do think it's a film that is a piece with its era, with the Obama era, which was, you know, busting stereotypes and promising a rising tide that would lift all boats. This era, it's not surprising, produced another Jackie Robinson movie, speaking about 42, of course, which I think is a pretty good movie. Chadwick Boseman is excellent as Robinson. Harrison Ford definitely gives one of the more lively late period performances of his career as Branch Rickey. But the thing that frustrates me about 42 that I think is noteworthy, it basically follows the exact same arc as the Jackie Robinson story, which came out 63 years prior. It follows him, you know, getting to the majors, suffering abuse, overcoming it, winning over his teammates. It's an important story. It was at the time, certainly. But it's strange that our perspective on this crucial racial event in American history hadn't shifted in that time. This film, for all its virtues, it still refuses to show the complexity of Jackie Robinson. It minimizes his anger. It avoids the subject, which is fascinating, of his court-martial when he was in the army for refusing to sit in the back of a bus. It basically makes him look like a saint for whom passive resistance came natural. And if you know anything about the real Jackie Robinson, that wasn't the case. So it just seemed a little too easy in 2013. But what it does get right, to me, is it's baseball. I think the game action in 42 is really crisp and clear and exciting in a way. And I mean, in that way, it does get Robinson right. The Jackie Robinson story had Robinson playing himself, and yet weirdly, he didn't look like himself on camera. He didn't display any of the speed or athleticism for which he was known. In 42, it's almost thrilling to watch him dance off of first base and mess with the pitchers' heads just through his sheer confidence and ability. And to me, that's when the film is at its best because it's working as a metaphor for the broader disruptions that his presence in the major leagues brought to society. You know, as I've interviewed people for this book, I would always ask them, like, what is the most underappreciated baseball movie? And inevitably the answer would come back, Sugar. This is a truly great baseball film that shows you life in the minor leagues with a different kind of authenticity as Bull Durham, but I think just as much authenticity. There are very few films that show you the minor leagues. There are very few films that show you Latino players in the minors. There are even fewer films, let's say no other films, that will show you a Latino player who quits the sport because he's happier without it. A really revolutionary thought. Every baseball movie, like quitting is losing, quitting is failure. In Sugar, quitting is success. That's amazing. This is the story of Miguel Sugar Santos. It's an independent film, not based on a true story, but probably based on many true stories. He gets signed in the Dominican Republic. He's brought to a small town in Iowa to begin his professional career. Starts well. He's getting a lot of encouragement, suffers a setback, and then basically he quits because he's unhappy. It's an immigrant story as much as a baseball movie, I think, but it's worth noting that this is probably a story that Major League Baseball didn't really want anyone to tell. They don't want us thinking about all the players who flame out and what becomes of their lives after, especially the foreign-born players. But, you know, even beyond that, I think there's something just wonderful about a movie about a guy who quits. And, you know, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but he ends up still playing baseball in the end, but just sort of on his own terms and doing it for the pure love of the game. And it's kind of a beautiful thing. As far as mainstream releases go, oh, sorry, there's Santos again. As far as mainstream releases go, the baseball movie has been in a fallow period, I think, for quite some time. There hasn't been a major release in a while. But there's one place that the baseball film is still thriving, and that is in the faith-based film world. I don't know if you know what faith-based films are, but it is a thriving subgenre of cinema, really its own mini industry. These are films made for and by evangelical Christians. And there have been dozens of Christian baseball movies made in the last 15 years. Yeah. And many of them go straight to streaming services. There's a streaming service called Pure Flix, which is specifically for faith-based films. Or they end up at Walmart, at Target, something like that, and people buy them. Occasionally they make it to cinemas. The Hill last year, that was a faith-based baseball film. It was just a kind of a big one with a higher budget, and Dennis Quaid, former movie star, let's say. Most of these films are not very good, to be honest with you, because they often draw their talent exclusively from evangelical circles. Sometimes they draw from Hollywood, and those ones are usually better. But in terms of their stories, they're not that different from the baseball films of the post-war era. It's kind of come full circle in a way. These are stories of redemption set in rural America. Home Run, which was not made exclusively with faith-based talent, is about a kind of debauched alcoholic former major leaguer who gets suspended after a tirade and returns to his hometown to clean up his life and coach a little league team that coincidentally is co-managed by his ex-girlfriend. A Mile in His Shoes is a movie about a disgraced former player who discovers a kid with autism who's a phenom on the mound, discovers him when the coach's car breaks down in the country. The exact same plot as Talent for the Game, a film that came out in the early 90s, and really similar to many plots from the 40s and 50s about great players who were discovered sort of out of nowhere. But these films are, they're formulaic and they're wholesome, really wholesome to a fault. And they are willfully unconcerned with the realities of baseball. In the 1940s, that made them mainstream because baseball movies were used to build up America as a symbol of democracy. But today, these films are niche. They're not even in movie theaters for the most part. And I think it's a neat way of showing how the values of this country and our expectations for baseball cinema have shifted so much in that time. So that's where baseball movies are now. Where have they gone? Why are there no more mainstream baseball movies? Well, I think they've gone to television with shows like Brockmire and Pitch and the remake of A League of Their Own. And of course, this is a boom period for baseball documentaries. I mean, there seems like there's a new one on Netflix every week and new series coming out all the time. And actually, the Yogi Berra documentary did play in theaters. So that really speaks to, I think, changes in the film industry, that mid-budgeted movies that are not about superheroes and are not action movies are just harder to get made these days. And a lot of those stories are going to television. But I don't feel that the baseball movie itself is dead yet. I'm actually hopeful. And here's why. The big knock against baseball cinema over the years from an economic standpoint has been that it doesn't travel. Baseball movies don't perform well internationally, because it was always thought of as an American game. In fact, Field of Dreams and Moneyball are two of the only baseball films to even get a significant theatrical release overseas, probably because they had big movie stars on their posters. But with the World Baseball Classic and other efforts to expand the appeal of the game to new lands, I think another baseball movie boom could be coming, one that doesn't see baseball as strictly an American symbol, but is a symbol for the world and the global dynamic. In fact, I think the World Baseball Classic would be an amazing setting for a baseball movie. You got minor leaguers who are taking on major leaguers for like the first time in their career, for their home country, maybe for the only time in their career. You got aging veterans trying to prove that they've still got it and earn another major league contract before they retire. You've got recently retired players who are managing for the first time, trying to show what they've got in that respect. All of it happening on the world stage with everybody watching. I think that the baseball movie, much like baseball itself, still has better days ahead. So that's my presentation. That's my book. Like I said, Baseball the Movie available now for pre-order. I'm going to be doing a bit of a book tour. I'm going to be in a lot of different places. As far as you guys are concerned, I'm going to be introducing a screening of A League of Their Own at AFI Silver in Washington, D.C. on July 13th. Love to see some of you out there. And if you would like me to come to your town, and there's a bookstore or movie theater there, I'd be happy to talk to you about all that. In the meantime, I'm happy to hear your questions, complaints, and criticisms.
Well done, Noah. That was great. Two films that I don't think you mentioned. I stepped away once or twice. And I wondered if you covered in the book. One would be the Clint Eastwood movie that came out in 2012, Trouble with the Curve.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a huge Eastwood fan. I have every film he's ever made. The man is almost 94. Um, Obviously, from a baseball purist standpoint, it doesn't really hold a lot of water. So I wondered your opinion on that one. And then also, if you saw the movie, I think it was called Mickey, that John Grisham wrote the screenplay for, and Harry Connick Jr. played the dad of a little leaguer. And they basically changed their names because they were in some legal trouble, and then ran off to a different part of the country, played under these assumed names. This kid, the phenom, made it all the way to the Little League World Series, and then the government figured out who they actually were. It's that came out maybe in like 2003 or four. Was just released on home video, probably VHS, DVD back then. So if you haven't seen that, it's pretty good. Like I said, Harry Connick Jr. is the only name person in it.
Yeah.
It's more about the youth baseball and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I actually have not seen Mickey. I did come across it on various lists, and I watched 85 baseball movies for this movie, but miraculously I did not get to all of them. There are even more than that.
Of course.
Those damn faith-based baseball movies really took up a lot of my time. But I had heard of it, and I will say that I didn't write about every baseball movie because I really tried to focus on those movies that to me tell the story of America and of baseball in the time period that I'm covering. And to do that, I focused more on the popular films, on the more mainstream films. I stuck up for Sugar, and I stuck up for Little Big League and a couple other movies that I think deserve more attention. But, I had to kind of stick to the ones that resonated with the public in a big way. And I will say, I do talk about Trouble with the Curve in the book. In fact, I put it next to Moneyball because to me, Trouble with the Curve is a response to Moneyball, not the movie, but to the idea of Moneyball. Everything that Moneyball says about front office guys and scouts, Trouble with the Curve says the opposite. It says that scouts are the only ones who know what they're doing, and front office guys are arrogant young jerks who, think you can learn everything from a computer. And I think the movie has some problems, but I do agree with you that it's sort of a perfect vehicle for Clint Eastwood, who has basically for 30 years been telling variations of the same story, which is great. I love it when auteurs do that, about guys who are older and are being dismissed and still have something to contribute. So whether you agree with the internal politics of Trouble with the Curve or not, I think it's a perfect fit for Eastwood, and he is great in that movie for sure.
Okay, Ed, I think you're next.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I appreciate it. I was curious about your thoughts regarding Field of Dreams. That's another one that sort of has bipolar reactions. And you're talking about realism, and people readily jumped all over the fact that they had a right-handed hitting
Yeah.
Shoeless Joe. Never mind the fact that all the esoteric things like voices appearing in the fields and dead people coming to play in baseball. That didn't seem to bother them as much as Shoeless Joe.
That's baseball fans for you right there.
Yeah.
Well, I think I have a lot to say about Field of Dreams, and I do say a lot in the book. I agree that it's divisive. I know from my limited experience, players don't like it as much as fans like it. And there's actually very little baseball in it, which is interesting to me because they talk about baseball in like every scene, but there's not a lot of actual game action in it. I've been back and forth on it over the years. I've gone through periods where I thought it was one of the weirdest, most nonsensical movies I've ever seen. And then I've gone through other eras where I'm in right now where I kind of think it's amazing. And I interviewed Michael Schur for the book. I guess most of you probably know who that is. He hosts the podcast with Joe Posnanski, and he's the creator he worked on The Office, and he created The Good Place and a lot of other TV shows. He was going to make a series adaptation of Field of Dreams, and it didn't happen because the A League of Their Own series was such a flop, and Amazon said no to him. But he had already written it. He had a whole team of writers, and he told me that the first day he was with the writers and he made his first big speech to the writers' room, I'm completely paraphrasing, but he said something like, this movie is a bubble. It's delicate. It sort of floats above the air. It's shiny. It glistens. When you look at it from different angles, it reflects different things. And our job as we're writing this adaptation is not to pop that bubble, to keep it afloat and to keep it whole. And I think that's a really awesome metaphor for kind of what this movie is, because it doesn't make sense. It defies logic. It defies everything we know about storytelling and narrative. And yet it's kind of amazing. And if you don't get a little choked up when the playing catch with his father, or the speech that James Earl Jones gives at the end, like, I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, I guess it's just not for you, but it's certainly for me.
Yeah, I've been a big fan of it too. But it's funny you mentioned the podcast, because if you look, or the podcast rather, if you go back, there was one point where Michael Schur and Posnanski were talking to Nick Offerman at Wrigley Field, and he has a tremendous takedown, including things like, the guy with a 40-acre farm buying one bag of seed in the middle of the year.
Yes.
Which,
and the economics of him losing his farm over a baseball field that's like probably 2 acres or 3 acres of corn. I mean,
right.
That rant is incredible. I highly recommend people try to find it if they can.
Thanks.
Hi. I have a question.
Yeah, hi, Karen.
What was the process that you used when you were choosing all the different movies? And which ones were the great ones, or which ones are the good ones?
Yeah, good question. Well, like I said, on the one hand, like, I had to choose movies that to me had something interesting to say about where the country was at the time, or where baseball was at the time. And that was how I structured the chapters. But there are also what I call interstitials in the book, in between each of the sections. Each section includes several chapters. And in those interstitials, I do make some space to talk about films that didn't fit the overall narrative, but that, like, if you write a baseball movie, you kind of have to find a way to talk about. People are going to expect it. So there is a chapter on The Naked Gun, for example, because that movie is 90 minutes and 30 minutes of it are at a baseball game. And it's kind of like, how do you not find a way to talk about that? So I talked about kind of the focus on umpiring, which is unusual in a baseball movie. And I debated whether it even counts as a baseball movie or not. And you'll have to buy the book to see where I landed on that. Go ahead.
I was also wondering what you thought about the movie Cobb.
Not good.
With Jamie Lee Jones or whatever.
Yeah, Tommy Lee Jones.
Jones.
Not a fan. Not a fan of that movie. I mean, I appreciate that it shows, how vile.
It was a whack job.
Yeah, but it's so unpleasant to watch that I don't know if there is a good movie to be made about Ty Cobb that I would actually want to watch, because he seems like he was quite an unpleasant man, and that is an unpleasant movie.
Good, thank you, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't the only one.
Oh, I think that movie has a pretty poor reputation, actually.
Okay.
I see a couple questions in the chat. Comments on The Rookie with Dennis Quaid. Not one of my favorites, to be perfectly honest. I know that movie means a lot to a lot of people and their fathers. For me, that movie, it's a great true story, but as a movie, I don't feel like it quite works. The narrative is sort of split in two between his him and his team says he has to try out for the majors if they win the championship, and there's that whole run. And then there's the second half, which is him working his way up to the majors. And I don't know, the film critic in me just sort of feels like that structure doesn't exactly work. And I don't know, it feels a little saccharine to me. I mean, I know there's a fine line in baseball movies between sentimental and saccharine, and that movie just tips a little bit over the edge where I feel like I'm being manipulated a little too hard. But I know people love that movie, and I respect that. I mean, loving a baseball movie is a wonderful thing. And then someone asked about the process I went through to get the book published. I do get this question a lot. So I have 10 years of freelancing as a film critic, and as I mentioned, a little bit as a baseball writer. I don't know how that baseball writing stuff happened, by the way. I was very lucky to get into that. And I got an assignment to go into the Mets clubhouse and report on Terrence Gore for the New York Times. And it was like the greatest day of my life, I have to say. I felt really fortunate. But I wanted to write a book, and I chose a topic that I knew I wouldn't get sick of talking about or writing about or thinking about for 3 years, which is really how long it takes from proposal to press tour. And I mean, there'd been a couple other baseball movie books out there, but I felt like the baseball movie book I wanted to write had not been written. So I wrote a proposal based on what I thought a proposal was supposed to look like, and I sent it to some agents. And 1 out of 30 was interested. And then we worked together on that proposal for publishers, and 2 out of I don't know how many were interested. And that was it. We went with 1, and then I wrote the book, and now I'm here talking to you. Any other questions, thoughts, criticisms, complaints?
Yeah. Do you talk through the Perfect Game? I guess that was the last of Kevin Costner's baseball movies, I think.
Oh, I think you mean For Love of the Game?
For Love of the Game.
Yeah,
Yes, you're
yeah.
right. Sorry. Yes.
It is mentioned, definitely. I know, you know who loves that movie? Baseball players love that movie. It's very weird. I mean, it sort of makes sense. They talk about that moment in the movie when he does the clear the mechanism thing, and he like shuts out the crowd so he can focus on what he's trying to do. And they all talk about that. In fact, Brandon McCarthy on the podcast spoke at length about that movie, and he was mercilessly mocked by Mike and Joe for it. But as being like very authentic, like that's something that they hadn't seen in a movie before. And I agree that the baseball stuff is pretty good in that movie, but I think the love story is just crap. To be perfectly honest, it's really poorly written and not very interesting. And I kind of wish they had just stuck with the game. But it's one of those movies that they got half right, and there's a lot of movies like that out there. All right. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you showing up and listening on this beautiful evening. And, I'm going to put my email in the chat here. So if you guys ever want to talk more about baseball movies or want information about where I'm going to be, just let me know and I'll sign you up for the mailing list and everything.
Quick question, Noah. Are you coming to the convention in Minneapolis?
I'm not sure yet. I'm not sure what's going to align with my schedule. Remind me of the dates.
I think it's August 7th to the 11th.
It's possible. I'm not sure yet, but I would like to. Yeah, I would like to be there and see everybody in person. That'd be fun.
That would be nice.
Mm-hmm.
All righty, guys. Well, much appreciated. Last time I looked, the Orioles are down to the Yankees. It happens. But now in a house that has split loyalties. Obviously, I'm Orioles first, and I'm a Cubs second, even though I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm married to a Phillies girl, so even though they're doing well like right now, I hope their wheels fall off and they fall down the commode a little bit. It's when you're a redundantly named team that has almost 12,000 losses, you get what's coming to you. So, much appreciated, everybody. You guys know how to reach me if you need anything. Be on the lookout for information on the Reading game, and that will be Sunday, June 30th. And I believe, if I'm right, the game is either 4 or 5 p.m. In Reading, Pennsylvania. So have a great week and stay cool. I think the temperatures, at least in Maryland, are going to drop a little bit. I'm not sure about other parts of the country. And, sad news on Mike Trout, but we're well into the baseball season, and a lot of things can still happen. So thank you, Noah, and you guys have a great week.
Thanks, Noah. That was a lot of fun.